Right. But the thing is that at one point I worked with a lot of people in France, and of course this word collaboration was something that they were extremely uncomfortable about using. And as we know in French history, the word collaborator doesn't sound right, doesn't sound very good. So we actually used to use the term work together. Shall we work together on something? And subsequently I've written a couple of texts about working methodology in relation to art, which try to suggest that certainly in Northern European and partly relatively privileged North American cultures, that a lot of this sense of working together is actually rooted in changes in elementary school and kindergarten education in the 60s and 70s, where the way of working was project-based. You were encouraged to go to school and like explore something, explore an idea, or work together, like you'll do this and I'll do this, or have a non-hierarchical creativity. And of course that still, that I think is at the root of some of the feeling that this is a good way. It does have some psychological root, but it also is political, because those teachers often were the most left-wing, the only really applied left-wing people you ever met. Like, they were the first ones to go on strike, or the first ones to have a position, or the first people to have a kind of politics that you met who were not like, we talked about families the other night, but they had a certain dynamic. So this is really important, this idea of working together. But working together can mean side by side and not face to face. And when I was young, of course, the artists who collaborated had an ampersand. They were like Gilbert and George, or so-and-so and so-and-so. And when I worked with people, we don't work equally. It's more like, I'm kind of embarrassed to say it, but I wrote a very short text in 1989 called the Scooby Doo complex, which was about the Scooby Doo model of working, which is like you and Shaggy go that way and me and Velma will get lost, and then, you see what I mean? But you're actually kind of working together to solve something. And I've kind of suppressed this text subsequently. But I pitched it against what I called the Disneyic way of working, which is to create a kind of illusion of a character, the artist character, who becomes a kind of cartoon person who can do anything, who can be this figure who can sweep through culture and create these amazing images, and only notices it's going wrong in that way you run off the cliff, and you only fall when you realize you're in midair. The Disneyic, I always felt, was a kind of inherently right-wing model, a softly right-wing model of art, which was much more connected to people like Jeff Koons, or it had a kind of logic to it. And the Scooby Doo model, which was Hanna-Barbera, I guess, was essentially much more to do with splitting up and meeting back somewhere. And if you work together in a way by accident. There's a lot of unmasking involved, unmasking the institution, finding out that the very person who was undermining you was the same person actually running the place, for example. So this Scooby-Doo thing actually was quite useful at the time. And also sounded deeply unserious, therefore irritated even further the kind of pious and prissy guardians or gatekeepers of art at that point.
In relationship to, there's an image of philosophy. We could call it a Cartesian image of philosophy of Descartes in his oven in the Netherlands, ruminating on the nature of certainty, and coming to a series of conclusions, which he publishes in the Discourse on the Method and the Meditations. It's this idea of the philosopher as this solitary character, that Rembrandt's painting of the philosopher. So we have that, and I guess this is a way into this question. Philosophy is group activity, right? Philosophy begins in a quite peculiar way. And the names are listed on the facade of the Brooklyn Museum on this side. It's extraordinary. You've got all the sophists right over there, Protagoras and Gorgias and the rest, and then Socrates. Now, Socrates is this old man that likes younger men, who asks questions which have the form "ti estin," what is it? What is it? And they kill him. End of story. Justly, because he was impious to the gods of the city, and he corrupted the youth. And most of his students were reactionary characters that wanted to overthrow democracy, which they did. He dies. Then a school is founded called the Academy. We don't know much about these schools, and we don't really know what they did, but they flourished outside the city of Athens, and then elsewhere across the ancient world. So, if there at one level is the fantasy in philosophy of the individual producer, the thinker, the thinker who's thinking difficult thoughts, then for me what's more important is the idea of the group, right? The idea of philosophy as a group activity, a dialogical activity of back and forth. There are numerous problems with that, which I could go into. It's usually a group of men, with the exception of the Pythagoreans, who were mainly women, but Pythagoras probably didn't exist, and they were vegetarians. That's a separate story. But usually men, and usually younger men having a relationship to an older man. So what you have in the philosophical group is some kind of master figure, some kind of big other, around whom the younger men congregate. And that still exists. Think about all those younger, eager men that congregate around people like Badiou or Zizek or whatever, and they believe in the master, right? They believe that the master will, from his lips, something will fall, will write it down, and it will be the truth. So there's that. So for me, one of the fantasies that I've been animated by in terms of my stuff is trying to group think in a way philosophically. It's very hard to do. Now, this sort of goes back towards the, I guess, the art world in a way. The longest collaboration I've done is with this novelist Tom McCarthy, and Tom and I worked together for about 12, 13 years or something like that. And this vehicle called the International Necronautical Society was developed as a vehicle within which we could do stuff. And we were interested in obscure corners of theory and modernist literature. And nobody in the academy or certainly in literary circles had any interest, but the art world did have an interest. So we found that our vehicle found a sort of garage in the art world, and we did all this weird shit in different places over a number of years. And then we wrote collectively. So it's another thing to think about, is that we had the anonymous persona of a society, right? The International Necronautical Society, and we could subsume whatever individuality we had into that group and write in the persona of the society. That was interesting.